Hey, I'm Anderson Cooper. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the 26th Annual DART Awards for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma. Every year, as you know, the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma at this Columbia Journalism School recognizes outstanding reporting that portrays traumatic events and their aftermath with accuracy, insight, and dignity, while illuminating the effects of violence and tragedy on individuals and families and communities. As journalists, it's our job to tell these hardest stories with sensitivity and care. And that commitment has never meant more than in this moment, amid a global pandemic, a reckoning with institutional racism, and devastating natural disasters. The DART Awards are the only prizes ratifying this kind of ethical, innovative reporting on trauma that I think the world needs now. Reporting that brings respect, connection, and a degree at times, when it's done well, of healing to people affected by overwhelming crisis and tragedy. All of this year's DART honorees exemplify this spirit. I'll be back later in the program to tell you about each of the winners, and then you'll enjoy a live roundtable discussion. In the meantime, it's my pleasure to welcome Bruce Shapiro, the DART Center Executive Director, who will tell you more about the DART Awards and the DART Center's important work.
Thank you, Anderson Cooper, and welcome to the 2020 DART Awards for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma. I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia Journalism School in New York City. Tonight I'm at home, like most of you. So much has changed since last year's DART Awards celebration in Columbia Journalism School's elegant World Room. As citizens, we've changed how we work, how we socialize, how we educate, how we grieve, how we protest. As journalists, we've changed how we report, how we get the news out. One thing that has not changed, the urgent need for compassionate, compelling, and informed journalism on the real impact of violence, crisis, and tragedy. Reporting that bears witness for individuals and communities who've endured abuse and loss, too often invisibly. Reporting that holds perpetrators of human rights violation to account, which illuminates the lived experience of trauma, both psychological injury and resilience, with care, precision, and dignity. Since 1994, it's been the unique mission of the DART Awards to recognize exemplary journalism on the impact of traumatic events, from the intimate sphere of family violence to the global arena of war. But there's more to it. Every DART Award winner, as you'll see tonight, is also an innovator, taking journalism somewhere it hasn't ever gone before. The DART Awards capture these innovations, passing the skills and approaches for effective trauma reporting onto future generations of news professionals around the world. The value of learning from DART Award winners has never been more evident. In recent months, my DART Center colleagues and I have talked to dozens of newsrooms about the challenges of reporting on the trauma-drenched crises of this moment. In each of those meetings, I've been lucky. I've had 26 years of DART Award winners perched on my shoulder, each showing their colleagues how it can be done. In these newsroom meetings in the last few months, so often some reporter, photographer, editor has said, as we all have, I think, all said to ourselves at some point lately, I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But when you encounter tonight's winners, I think you'll come to a different conclusion. Trauma-informed reporting is the light to the end of the tunnel, not only communicating information, but modeling empathy, inquiry, connection, and engagement with the toughest human experiences. There are two parts to tonight's program, just as there are two goals to the DART Awards. And to keep things running smoothly, we're going to combine a few pre-recorded segments with live conversation. We'll introduce you to the DART Awards and, guided by Anderson Cooper, to this year's honorees. Then we'll have a live conversation going under the hood of this powerful, innovative reporting and leaving time for you to be part of that conversation. First, though, we're going to hear from three very important friends of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma and of the DART Awards. Steve Call, Dean of Columbia Journalism School and our boss. Jim Lammers, the CEO of DART Container Corporation, who has been a friend ally and counselor to the Dart Center from its earliest beginnings, and Chris Duggan, director of the Kenneth B. Dart Foundation. We're very grateful to all of them, to Steve, to Jim, and to Chris, as well as to Ken Dart, who generously sustains the Dart Center's core operations and these awards, and from whom Chris will bring an important message tonight.
I'm Steve Call, and I too want to welcome all of you to this virtual Dart Awards evening. I'm very proud that we host the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma here at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia. I've watched Bruce's leadership and the Dart Center's work with admiration for years now, and I've also watched that work become ever more central to journalism, to the concerns of newsrooms, to the needs of newsrooms, as well as relevant to the people whose stories we tell. We live, unfortunately, in a world of trauma, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. At this particular moment of global crisis, news organizations around the world are turning to the Dart Center for very practical help, and there's a reason. Infusing journalism practice with the best insights from psychology and neuroscience and other fields of scholarship. The Dart Center has a special authority that is strengthened by being housed at this great university and in our global-minded journalism school. So for all these reasons, we are really deeply grateful to Ken Dart for his vision and for his support of these awards, and for the whole Dart Center enterprise, which has done so much to strengthen our school. Tonight, though, is about journalism, and you'll hear from this year's Dart Awards winners. And I'm happy to say you'll hear some good news about the Dart Center itself. So I want to just add to this year's honorees. I hope you enjoy this opportunity to have your reporting celebrated. And I know that others who will be with us tonight listening, students and others, will benefit enormously from hearing you talk about how your work came about. And I know that in sharing those insights, you're going to inspire a lot of our colleagues with your rigor and with your excellence. So congratulations to everybody.
I've had the pleasure of working closely with the Dart Center since its founding in 1999. In 1994, the Dart Foundation of Mason, Michigan, established by the late William A. and Claire T. Dart, launched the annual Dart Awards. The foundation wanted to honor compassionate, dignified reporting on victims of violence that was informed by evidence-based trauma science and reflected Dart family values. The awards attracted powerful entries from some of the country's greatest newsrooms. 5 years later, the foundation folded the Dart Awards into the new Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which today is housed at Columbia Journalism School. In 2014, a second generation picked up the torch. Kenneth B. Dart made the first in a series of multi-year gifts that have kept the Dart Center at the forefront of journalism innovation. I've watched the Dart Center grow through crises like 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina to the current global pandemic. The Dart Awards have grown too, from a single newspaper-only prize to a multimedia, multi-winner recognition program that never deviates from its core commitment to compassion, ethics, and scientifically informed reporting.
Good evening to you all. My name is Chris Duggan. I'm director of the Kenneth B. Dart Foundation and vice president of Dart Enterprises in the Cayman Islands. I'm once again delighted to be with you all this evening representing Ken Dart. And on behalf of Ken, he's asked me to send you all his very best wishes, as well as his congratulations and gratitude to all of this evening's winners. Every year, I'm blown away by the outstanding stories that are told as part of the Dart Awards. And this year, ladies and gentlemen, is certainly no different. Not only are these reporters changing journalism, but they're also changing lives and saving lives. And while I wish we could be celebrating in person this evening, the pandemic keeping us apart only reinforces the value of informed, compassionate, and responsible reporting on trauma and resilience. The lessons from this year's Dart Award-winning stories are exactly what the world needs to hear right now. The work of the Dart Center to support journalists telling the hardest stories has never been more important than it is now. And that's why I'm especially pleased to announce this evening, ladies and gentlemen, that Ken Dart recently made a new gift to the Columbia Journalism School of $2.25 million to continue the outstanding work of the Dart Center, which will include establishing an endowment for the Dart Awards to ensure that this kind of incredibly powerful journalism continues to be honored and upheld for many years to come. I'm honored to be participating again this year, and I'd like to thank the Dart Center team for all that they continue to do to promote ethical, responsible, and outstanding journalism. They're an amazing team doing amazing things. And finally, congratulations again to all of our incredible winners. We appreciate you all, and we appreciate all that you continue to do. Thank you.
Before I introduce you to this year's Dart Award honorees, I just want to say how much I admire their work. We all know that journalism is under attack, and these honorees tonight have shown us all the importance of reporting and being not just accurate, but being human and humane. The Dart Center's commitment to ethical and impactful reporting on trauma and its aftermath have really never been more important. I'm here with you tonight to recognize the 2020 Dart Award honorees. 5 innovative projects published or broadcast last year spotlighting the experiences of victims and survivors that make significant contributions to the public's understanding of trauma and resilience. School employees sometimes called it serving time. Children were sent into isolation after refusing to do classwork, for swearing, for spilling milk, for throwing Legos. They begged to be let out, they cried for their parents, they banged the walls at times until their knuckles bled. In some cases, children were hurt so badly that ambulances were called. ProPublica Illinois and the Chicago Tribune received an honorable mention for The Quiet Rooms, reported by Jody Cohen, Lakidra Chavis, and Jennifer Smith Richards. These reporters trawled 50,000 pages of documents from the 2017 to 2018 school year and learned that in Illinois, children were put in isolation every school day for reasons that violate the law. Judges described the series as a tour de force of investigative reporting and accountability journalism. They called it exhaustive, fair, and outstanding from all angles. A day after The Quiet Rooms was published, Illinois ended isolated seclusion of children in schools across the state.
What makes you enjoy hurting people and torturing me when you know I never did anything wrong? And in silence, I could hear him, like breathing very heavily. And I think he was crying.
NPR News received an honorable mention for Syria, Torture Survivors Seek Justice, reported by Deborah Amos with photographs by Jacoby Adam and Axel Uberg. The series was produced by Michael May with editing by Alex Leff, Hannah Block, Larry Kaplow, Emily Bogle, and Claire Harbage. For almost a decade in Syria, the Assad regime has waged a brutal war against civilians, jailing, torturing, and killing them. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees have fled to Europe.
Do you feel safe here?
Nope, I don't feel safe, but I used to that. They killed my dad, my brothers, my cousins. They're still killing.
The series focuses on a network of survivors and lawyers seeking justice for regime officials in European courts. Judges call the series a case study in thorough, humane, and complete reporting, applauding Deborah Amos for describing but not lingering on traumatic situations and focusing on resilience.
I thought I was going to die at Clearview. I thought my life would end there in a log cabin in the middle of nowhere.
We have in these programs children who have committed suicide, runaways, children held in solitary confinement.
We are in support of dissolving the board and moving this program to proper regulation.
The Missoulian received an honorable mention for Troubled Kids, Troubled System, a series exposing grave abuse at residential schools for at-risk children in Montana. Reported by Lucy Tompkins, Seaborn Larson, and Cameron Evans, with photographs by Tommy Martino, editing by Gwen Florio and Kathy Best. The series prompted legislation that shifted oversight of such programs to Montana's health department, bolstering protections for enrolled kids. The health department also removed 27 children from one residential program. Judges praised the incredible commitment on the part of a small newsroom to revisit a persistent problem concerning the ongoing, unrelenting abuse of children.
When they told me my case was closed, I felt very betrayed and felt like I needed to do something.
And then what did you think you needed to do?
I needed to work my own case.
The Plain Dealer received a DART Award for the series Case Closed, reported by Rachel DeSalle and Andrea Samakis, with photography by Lynn Aishe, editing by Ellen Stein-Burbach, Kelly Benham-French, Melody Smith, Wendy Carr McManamum, and Joel Downey. When Sandy Fedor learned that police had stopped searching for the man who raped her, she decided to look for him herself. What she found was a serial rapist with a rap sheet spanning decades. After the story was published, the Cleveland City Council held special hearings, and the police chief apologized to Sandy. Sandy was also asked to help train new police recruits in the sex crimes unit. Judges praised Case Closed for what they called successfully intertwining a visceral survivor's point of view narrative with traditional investigative reporting, revealing what they said was a pattern of systemic police department failure dating back decades.
Yes, I feel sad sometimes. I do feel sad inside, inner in myself. Sometimes I think to commit suicide, then I say no, I will not do that. Even no one helped us. No one.
Reported by Jennifer Percy with photographs by Adam Ferguson, the New York Times Magazine received the DART Award for How Does the Human Soul Survive Atrocity? That's the question Jan Kieselhan, a Kurdish-German psychologist, asked when thousands of people who'd been held captive by ISIS were reunited with their families. The piece follows the mission to train the first generation of psychotherapists in Iraq to work with survivors, including many children. Judges call the piece explanatory reporting at its best and praise the equally matched excellence of the writing and photography. It leaves, they said, the reader haunted not only by the shattered identities of these children, but by our own moral failings. It's really been my pleasure to highlight the important work of this year's DART Award honorees. Congratulations to all. Now back over to the DART Center's Bruce Shapiro in a conversation about this remarkable reporting.
As I think you can tell from this very powerful video, the DART Awards have always been not only recognition of an outstanding individual journalist, but they've actually been a team prize, because to take on these kind of subjects, to take on the children of ISIS, to take on a neglected, uninvestigated sexual assault case, all the rest of the stories you heard about, takes an extraordinary commitment across a newsroom, work by journalists, by photojournalists, by editors, sound editors, all of them together. So tonight, while we're going to hear from some of the individual journalists who put these stories together, we're really going to salute them all. And for that, I want to invite you, first of all, to, if you have something with bubbles in it, put it in a glass, or if you have something with caffeine in it, or anything else. And secondly, I'm going to turn this little bit of the ceremony over to Chris Duggan from the Kenneth B. Dart Foundation and his colleagues, who you should know are living in an area that is blessed to be COVID-free, at least for now. So they're actually in the same office celebrating with you. And I think Chris and his colleagues are going to lead us in a little bit of a toast.
Sure. Thanks very much, Bruce. And thanks to Anderson for a very powerful introduction to this evening's award winners. Every year when I'm in New York for this event, I always say the same thing, and I'm going to say it again tonight. It's whenever I'm there, everyone's thanking us, thanking the Dart Center for all that we do. But really, it's for us to thank these journalists for what they do. They do absolutely incredible work, often putting themselves in harm's way to get the stories out to all of us around the world. And really, on behalf of Ken Dart and all of my colleagues, I really want to thank them. We really take for granted every morning when we wake up that the newspaper is going to be on our desks for us to read, or that we log on to the various news websites and we expect to read the stories, but we don't really appreciate what goes into reporting these stories. And so on behalf of all of us at DART, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of our winners and all the journalists worldwide, especially now with what the world's facing. Thank you for all that you do. And as we said earlier, Ken has made a renewed commitment to journalists around the world, and we're delighted to continue to support the amazing work of the Dart Center, Bruce and his team, what you do. So congratulations to all the winners.
Indeed.
As Bruce said, I'm joined by a lot of my colleagues here from Dart, so we all want to wish you all congratulations and thank you for all you do.
And if this were a real room and not a webinar, you would hear the applause of the, 500 people who registered for this seminar. Extraordinary, this conversation, extraordinary amount. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, DART colleagues, for all you do to help make the work of the DART Center possible. So we've had one kind of fun, the celebration. Now we're going to have another kind of celebration. We're going to go to a conversation with the winners, with the winning teams. And let me tell you how this is going to work, since it was an extraordinary pool of entries and some extraordinary winners this year. We want time for all of them. So we're actually going to break the next block of time into 3 parts. First of all, I've broken our DART Award winners up into 2 groups, more or less thematically linked. All these stories connect in different ways, but we'll first hear from Jennifer Percy and Adam Ferguson from the New York Times Magazine and Deb Amos from NPR about their work. Then we'll hear from Rachel DeSalle, Andrea Simakis from Case Closed, Lucy Tompkins from the Missoulian, Jennifer Smith-Richards from ProPublica Illinois and the Chicago Tribune about their stories. And each group, I'll talk with them for about 20 minutes, give or take. When we finish the 2 groups, we'll go to questions from you. And the way to do this is with the Zoom Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. We're doing this both to prevent bandwidth issues and to just enable us to pick out questions that seem to relate to one another and to these panelists especially well. If questions occur while we're having the conversation, throw them into that QA chat box, or you can wait until we go to them. So now I'm going to call to the podium, or at least call to the Zoom screen, Jennifer, Adam, and Deb Amos. And when we're all in one place, we can begin talking for a little while. I see Jen, I see Deb. And now I see Adam. And, you know, this spans, it strikes me that this panel spans the spectrum of journalism craft. We have a writer, we have a radio journalist, and we have a photojournalist. This is wonderful. And Adam, you should turn your sound on for whenever it is we get to talk to you. Okay. And actually, I'm going to begin, Adam and Jennifer, with how does the human soul survive atrocity? You know, one of the motivations for starting the DART Award in the first place was to help the public understand how trauma science can help people who've survived atrocity, who've been through the worst stuff. And yet, telling the story of that, telling the story both of trauma and of recovery is a little bit like watching grass grow. It's kind of challenging. Maybe, Jen, could you talk about how and why you decided to approach this story in the way in which you did? And then maybe Adam, I'll have a question for you about images. But talk, Jen, a little bit about how you got to this and why you ended up deciding to focus so much on the work of a clinician in a country that we all think we've heard too much about as an American audience.
Yeah, so I had been reporting in Iraq for several years, and actually started going to Iraq when the caliphate took over. And I remember sort of like standing on the front lines and looking out into ISIS territory and thinking about the people inside there, what they were experiencing. And I knew from that moment that I wanted to talk to survivors when they came out. I wanted to write about that aftermath. And the stories, of course, coming out of the caliphate were horrendous. And more, the more I heard, the more I wondered, how were these people going to get through this when they came out? So it was sort of like this black hole of mystery. And I ended up waiting until the final battle to go over there when the caliphate fully fell. And, you know, initially I was interested in talking to children and families about what they experienced, but I also felt like that I didn't just want the story to be about that. And I looked around and talked to a lot of psychologists on the ground, and then that's how I kind of ran into the story of Dr. Kizalan, who was starting the first psychotherapy program in Iraq. And he felt like a vehicle into telling a very unique story of trauma that I hadn't seen before, which is to look not only at the resilience of these people and recovery in situations that seem almost impossible to recover from, like unimaginable trauma, the worst trauma imaginable. So, and the way he was going about it was just effortless and beautiful and straightforward, almost in a way. So I used him as a vehicle to the story. And I also thought that was important because it really opened up a conversation about something broader than just the Yazidis or the Kurds. It really made me think about migration crisis and refugees in Europe and America, and how the kind of healthcare they're receiving and how culture is so important for that transition.
And talk a little bit about this particular culture-centered approach that you focused on.
Yeah, so it's transcultural psychotherapy, which is basically, you know, Kizalan would describe it as just applying Western techniques to a non-Western setting. For example, you can't just necessarily apply, first I'll say that about 80% of psychotherapy research and mental health research is done in a Western context. So there's things that shift. Language is important, coping strategies, metaphors of pain, religion, taboos, the relationship between male and female, all that kind of stuff needs to be taken into account. And so he was noticing that there was a lot of misdiagnosis going on in Germany among refugees, and that also among patients in Iraq, which not only was suffering from that misdiagnosis, but there were also just simply a lack of psychologists in general.
Yeah, and it struck me that he became kind of a bridge into the stories of these folks, of people who have suffered so much. And also when in working with younger people, with kids, a kind of antidote to, I think, the idea that certain kinds of childhood trauma simply means we should write these kids off, that they are simply never going to be reintegrated. And that they're, just as in an earlier generation in the US, some folks predicted that children of urban violence would turn into a generational wolf pack. I think there's been a lot of fear internationally about children of the caliphate, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's your first instinct. You sort of look at them and think that they can't be saved, or that there's something wrong with them. But in fact, their behavior, Kizalan told me, was very normal. If they weren't responding the way they were, then that would be abnormal. And you know, we could talk more about radicalization and kind of all that stuff, but these children were able to adapt very, very quickly, and actually much faster than adults. And that's actually was very heartwarming information to hear, that was just simple treatments, simple psychotherapy techniques. They can really adapt quickly to a new environment.
Adam, when you kind of came onto this assignment, you're in this interesting position of needing to visually tell the stories of people who are in transition. I mean, we saw your photos in the little film about your story. Talk about some of the choices you faced. It struck me that these pictures were neither sentimental nor overtly melodramatic. They're interestingly balanced images. Talk a little bit about that.
I think the thing about trauma is it's a very abstract thing to illustrate. So kind of coming at it as a visual storyteller, I felt like I had to make images which alluded to something that wasn't necessarily in front of me or in front of the camera. I'd sit down with these kids who had, some of them had spent half of their lives, held by ISIS or with ISIS. And they were reconciling their lives back home, but still had this kind of huge experience that was elsewhere. So, I really sat down with, the different individuals and characters and tried to make a photograph that somehow alluded to something that was going on outside of the frame and alluded to that trauma in kind of an abstract nature. And
was it challenging to win the kind of a trust that a photographer needs to get people at their ease with folks who have every reason in this case to kind of trust no one, who've been repeatedly betrayed?
Yeah. Bruce, I mean, it quite often is the case, but in this particular case with the Yazidi community, they endured so much trauma that they kind of received me and Jennifer, I think, with arms wide open. They really wanted their story told so desperately. And yeah, so the trust came easily. All the families were very gracious and invited me into their homes.
Speaking of trust, Deb, you there's a kind of intimacy, and we heard this in the little clip there. There's an intimacy to your audio reports here that also reflects a deep trust. You have individuals talking about the most humiliating and extreme experiences, and also about their responses to trying to testify against these folks. And we heard, that one voice just now talking about confronting his perpetrator, his torturer. You're trying to tell a story of torture in sound that is human and humane, not melodramatic. How did you approach these survivors and gain the kind of trust that got the mic that close and got our ears that close to their own hearts and brains?
I think, look, I'm trying to tell the same story as the New York Times Magazine story. How do you survive the most terrible things? And it takes time. It took 2.5 days all day into the for the first interview. And I think the second thing is you can't dwell on the particulars. I mean, there is a torture porn in journalism, and you have to be careful, especially in radio, because in radio and audio, you ask the audience to imagine what you're describing. So you have to take that responsibility for what you're doing. It's one thing to look at the photographs. It's one thing, video, all of that you can move yourself back from. You cannot with audio. You are forced to imagine it. So I kept those details as spare as I could. And there were some people along the way that it was very clear that they could not speak. It would shatter them to do so. And so you also have to be able to judge who can speak. and who you'll have to wait till the next time you do the story.
And how did, you're in the context of a legal proceeding. How did you make that choice? How did you make that decision about who can speak and who can't?
Omar El-Shogri, who you heard tonight, has almost become a professional testifier. He has the resilience to tell his story. I think he does it for therapy. I met many people who tell their stories for their own personal therapy. In fact, many of them said that testifying in court was therapy. The first witness in the case in Germany was Firas Fayyad, and he's a filmmaker. He was awarded 2 nominations for Academy Awards for The Cave and the Last Man in Aleppo. He got on that stand and he testified to being sexually assaulted in jail. The first time he'd spoken about it publicly, the first time, he hadn't even told his parents. And when it was over, and I did a separate piece about this, when it was over, he said, I was relieved. There's something about justice and trauma. It's important, one thing for the other. And I think as small as this trial is, people do feel like there is therapy in justice.
Jennifer, let me ask you something, and actually maybe all three of you. Something that I know is on the minds of many of my Columbia Journalism School students these days, and on the minds of many younger reporters, which is how to do this kind of reporting without unnecessarily re-traumatizing your subjects, or indeed, how do you think about that dilemma, the risk of distress versus the importance of getting the material you need to tell an important story? How do you balance that? Jen, what's your approach, and how do you do the math?
Yeah, I mean, and for this story, it felt like we had some guidance, at least because I was able to really focus on talking to subjects that were under the care already of Kizlan and his students, and first talk to them about how to go about interviews, if there's anything I should or should not say. There were some moments where some of the psychologists said, please stop asking those questions, you're going to traumatize them. So then we would back up. Of course, oftentimes that we don't always have that kind of voice guiding us through the material. So in a lot of ways, I approach traumatized subjects by asking a very sort of open-ended questions, giving them agency in the interview by saying, always like, just tell me your story, and really have them guide me through the material without cornering them. And I can kind of approach difficult topics and kind of see how they react. And so I kind of feel like there's a circling that goes on around the most difficult moments, and I can back away, because oftentimes I also find that it's not that important for me to know that much about this big event. It's actually less interesting. I mean, even in short stories, so the violence, it's very effective. The most violent moments occur off scene, right? So I mean, in some ways, just on a level of craft, it can be very effective. Like you can use that to your benefit.
So you can really lean into it. Yeah, Adam, how do you think about that visually? How do you think about distress, trauma, comfort, all of that?
I mean, for all the portrait sittings, I sat and had conversations with the guardians and the children that I photographed. And I think there is a catharsis in that for people, just to feel like someone's coming to listen to them, and it's validating for their story. And I think, it's similar to the appearing in court analogy that Deb used before. I think there's a small amount of healing in that for people. So that's part of the process. I think, photography is an inherently kind of exploitive and invasive in medium in many ways. And I always try and navigate that as delicately as possible with subjects. There's a clear consent, and And I do my best to not make anybody feel uncomfortable and have them participate in a way that's collaborative more than invasive.
And Deb, what about you? I mean, and this is really being hotly debated in journalism right now. You know, how should we approach traumatized subjects? How do we make it work for them, or are there places we shouldn't go? Right.
Two things. Look, I knew a lot about the Syrian conflict because I'd covered it for 10 years and I was in Damascus and I wrote a book there. And so I had a lot of cultural touchstones. I wasn't unfamiliar. I was very happy that on the second day, Omar El-Shogri took me back to his apartment, a place that he got special permission from the Swedes to not list his address because he was under some attack by people who knew where he was. So I knew that it was okay, that, you know, I'd been given sort of a certificate to ask some questions because now I was in his home. But I also wanted to portray exactly what you're talking about. There are some people that you shouldn't. And I was very happy that the attorney allowed me to go with him when he was taking a potential witness to her first meeting with a trauma counselor. And the trauma counselor came out and looked at me and said, no. And I knew exactly what she meant. No, you cannot do an interview with this woman because she will shatter if you do. And the woman was watching and cried and said, I'm sorry, I failed you. And I said, you didn't fail me at all. I will come back. When you're ready, I will ask you your story, but you did not fail anybody. I think you have to listen. I think you have to be open to people's stories, and you do have to know when you can't.
Well, I think that's a kind of a good note to close this little sub-conversation on. And then when we bring you back, there may be some other questions about storytelling and other things that you want to bring up. We can get to that, but I'm kind of mindful of the clock and want to make sure that we have time not only for group 2, but for lots of questions from the audience. So if Team DART could now bring up Rachel DeSalle, Andrea Simakis, Lucy Tompkins, and Jennifer Smith-Richards, we can go to Team 2. But thank you, Jen, Adam, and Deb.
Thanks, Bruce.
Are we all here? I think we are. Okay. So first of all, welcome and congratulations to all of you. I think, you know, Rachel and Andrea, I'm going to begin with you. And there are a couple of things I should say to the audience to contextualize some of what I'm going to say. First and most importantly, Sandy Fedor, whom Rachel and Andrea followed for more than a year in their reporting, is, I think, in the Zoom room tonight. And Sandy, we salute you. This award, it's extraordinary for a survivor to collaborate over such a long period of time and in such detail with journalists. And this award, I think, belongs in part to you as well. We salute you. And I should also tell our audience here that the DART Award goes to the news organization that produced these stories, but journalism being what it is these days, after the DART Award was issued, the Cleveland Plain Dealer shrank a lot, laid off a whole lot of reporters, and both our DART Award winners are no longer in the Plain Dealer newsroom. An enormous loss to Cleveland, an enormous loss to all the communities that they have reported on for many years. Okay, with that out of the way, I mean, in a way, this is kind of context. The two of you took this extraordinary journey with Sandy. In the many years of the DART Award and in the many years I've been following this kind of journalism, I've never seen anything quite like it, with a woman who is investigating her own case in the face of official neglect and simply driving it forward. How did you find Sandy. And how did you begin establishing a relationship of such trust? And Rachel, both of you will need to unmute.
Thanks, Bruce. So actually, Sandy found us. She reached out to me through a trusted connection who's a therapist that I had worked with and known through other stories. And really, when she reached out, she didn't call and say, I would like you to write a story about what's going on. She, I think, was kind of desperate. She didn't know what to do because it had been years since she was assaulted. And what she kind of said was, I can't figure out why the police don't want to solve this case. I just don't understand. And she kind of took us through what she had done and in her own words, and basically said, on the first day, I gave them all the information they needed. And at that point, she was really struggling. And what I realized is that she didn't feel safe because this perpetrator was still out there. He had not been arrested or charged or anything like that. And so I think when we started working on the story, that was the first part of what we had to grapple with, was like, what was the way we could tell the story when the person who was navigating this still was very much in the trauma and not feeling safe.
And Andrea, how did you think about that problem? What were your instincts as the nature of the story became clear?
It was a process where we learned as we went, honestly. We would often, or in the beginning, we would meet Sandy at her therapist's office, and we would all sit together and take her through question by question. And if we saw her getting tense, or even sometimes we couldn't perceive how a question was affecting her. And that was very, that was something we were mindful of. Like, we have to pay attention. It's not the kind of interview where you put down a tape recorder and look down at your notes, you know, and just take people through at a rapid fire pace. We had to we had to give her the questions at a rate that she was comfortable with. And sometimes we just knew it was time to stop. And we stopped, and then we said, we'll come back again. And we'll come back again and again. And sometimes we had to go back over the same ground because, as people who study trauma know, memories get fragmented. And so we often went back over the same questions. And Sandy was amazing because she tolerated that. She didn't say, why are you asking me that again? She was open constantly to the process. So we were very lucky to have her as a collaborator. You so well put it.
One of the things that struck me as I reread it is that the three of you together produced a kind of detective story, right? In not only a kind of a moving journey of a survivor's quest for justice, but actually a detective story which revealed a serial predator at the heart of this. Was there a point at which in which your understanding of the story changed, in which it became clear what was emerging on the horizon of this?
Yeah, Bruce, I think that was one of the most difficult things about this story, is because not only was it unfolding as we were reporting, but we were really trying to combine like an investigation of who this perpetrator was and why they were being arrested, but at the same time, an investigation of the police and the system. We were trying to interrogate kind of different suspects. And at the same time, you know, being mindful of where Sandy was at, you know, and Sandy and I have talked about this a number of times. I don't know that I'd ever reported on a story before where, you know, you're interviewing someone and they really start to go into a flashback. And, you know, navigating that, I was so glad that we had, you know, Kate, her therapist, there. But, you know, we were always so careful to say to her, you know, is this okay? Like, you know, do we need to stop? But she was the one, in the same way that she wanted to investigate the rape and make sure that nobody else got hurt, that she wanted to push through those moments. And sometimes, to be 100% honest, it was, you know, Andrea and I who maybe had to take a break. I remember a couple of times, one in particular, when we watched the police video of her first disclosure to the police, that I think we both left there, and I'm not quite sure who was in worse shape between the three of us, but it was a really powerful moment, because it was the first time we saw with her that she had given them every bit of information they needed the first time she talked to them.
There's so much we could ask. I'm going to ask you just one very specific thing, and then we'll move on and maybe circle back to some other stuff, which is about the visual choices in this story. There's all kinds of really inspiring and moving pictures of Sandy, but there's also images of the perpetrator, the name of the perpetrator. This is somewhat contentious material sometimes, especially in the victim rights movement. How did you think through how much of the perpetrator to include? And was that something that was challenging to work out with Sandy?
Yes, we actually made a decision that every image that we were using in print and online, Sandy would see first, and Sandy would tell us, I'm good with that. And that was very deliberate on our part. We also were very mindful that this was Sandy's story, Sandy's investigation. And so we felt it was important for people to see the perpetrator, to understand who he was, but not give him too much space. So again, we really had to, we wanted you to know that he was serial. That was very important to us. We wanted readers to know he had a history. And we wanted also readers to go through with Sandy when she discovered who he was, which is a part of the mystery, the detective work that she did. I mean, as she's clicking through screen after screen, when she finally finds him, we wanted readers to go along with her and find out information about him as if they were sitting next to her and doing it at the same time.
Yeah, and it works extraordinarily well. And I would simply urge everyone to go to the Dart Center website, where you will find the complete package of stories. Lucy, I'm gonna go to you now. Lucy Tompkins, you know, you first of all, you did this story, this Dart honored story, in a newsroom of, I think, 8 people. You exposed abuses in state-funded schools, horrific abuses in wilderness schools and other institutions, in a tiny rural newsroom. How'd you do that?
Well, first I want to clarify that these schools are not state-funded; they're private. But I did it in addition to all of the you know, daily news education beat stuff that I was doing, which meant sometimes, you know, working after hours. But yeah, I mean, and then I had help from colleagues who joined the effort later, who also you know, piled it on top of the daily stories we were doing.
One of the things we kind of talk a lot about with the Dart Awards of reporters learning from reporters and innovation driving innovation. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding that something like that led you to this story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in college we read Alexandra Zayas's series about unregulated schools, similar to the ones that we wrote about in Florida. And she found that there was a specific exemption to their, that allowed them to be unregulated. So I wanted to see, because I'd known about these schools in Montana and known people who had been sent to them, and wanted to see if we had maybe a similar exemption that let them just operate unregulated. And we do. And yeah, I ended up actually calling Alex when I was getting started, and she gave me a lot of great advice.
So you turned to her as a mentor.
I did,
not only turned to her reporting, but turned to her. Mm-hmm. What was in a story like this? There's a balance of data, of getting hard numbers and of the human.
Mm-hmm.
What was the kind of trajectory, the methodology that you laid out and follow? What was your work plan for this?
Well, there was a lot of documents that helped us kind of guide us in this story. And I think that was kind of the backbone of it. But obviously that doesn't hold the same weight and power as speaking with actual people who are, living in these programs. So
Yeah.
I think it really helped to kind of have the documents lay out, like, every school had to say exactly what their policies were and how what punishments they used. And we were able to get all of that. And then when a student would say, they did this is the way that they punished us, then I could see like that is evidently true based on their own documents.
One of the challenges of education reporting generally, but particularly a story like this, is there are a lot of legal challenges and ethical challenges around consent when you're talking to young people. And in this case, these are young people who've been, in some cases, through the juvenile justice system or who are having other kinds of emotional difficulties in life. How did those negotiations go? How did you kind of win the trust with a bunch of challenged and challenging teenagers about some very difficult experiences?
I think many were eager to talk because I think after leaving these schools and having complicated feelings about the experience, not a lot of people kind of trusted or understood what that was like. And so some of the people I talked to had been kind of gathering their own evidence for years, trying to get people to listen. So that was, an easy negotiation because they were eager to talk. For other people, it was a lot more careful, and I had to give them, a lot of agency in what they would include. Some people's names we didn't include because they were really young and had, were victims of some, sexual crimes and things like that.
And one quick word on the impact of the story. Just what happened when the story came out?
Great. Yeah. So some great things. One school was shut down, one of the ones that had been more problematic and that state agencies had been looking at for years, but hadn't had any real authority to get to shut down, excuse me. But then this also came out during a legislative year, which happens every other year in Montana. So the regulation was changed to the health department in the state, and then there was another law also passed that criminalized sex between counselors or any staff at these schools and students.
So extraordinary change out of
Yeah.
a series of stories done by a young reporter in an 8-person newsroom.
Yeah.
And we should say that Lucy is no longer at the Missoulian. She's now at the New York Times, but this is an extraordinary accomplishment, and hats off to you. Jennifer, let's talk a little bit about the quiet rooms. Story, again, about really challenged children being abused, in this case, in state institutions. This was a story that wasn't really on anyone's radar. How did you get started on it?
Yeah, so this was a practice that was in so many places and had been reported on before here and there. And I think what wasn't on people's radars was how incredibly common seclusion and restraint are inside public schools. And I don't think it was on people's radar how the practices actually worked. I don't believe people could visualize what children were going through inside seclusion rooms and what a physical restraint actually looked like, and that it was a particularly violent action.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me. I remember a shocking number of decades ago now, in Illinois, and in Massachusetts and a number of states, there were in the 1970s enormous scandals about the abuse of seclusion and restraint against children in psychiatric hospitals. But the idea that it's going on in schools, I think, kind of came as a shock to people. You had this interesting kind of challenge here, again, like Lucy, that combined data with really finding the characters and winning the trust of people who've been through difficult stuff. What was the reporting trajectory like once you began to dig into it?
We didn't understand at first, I think, how massive an undertaking it was going to be, and that we were going to have such, a data-heavy story. We thought, we'll ask some questions and get some documents from school districts just to understand how they're documenting these interventions and how they view the interventions. We built this database and got through 1,000 interventions documented, and then 10,000, and then 20,000, and realized that one of the things that we were going to be able to tell people is just this minimum number of how frequently this happens in just a school year plus. We ended up going through more than 50,000 pages of documents to get that understanding. But yes, we had to speak to people who had experienced seclusion and restraint and had some sort of interaction at a school. And it turns out that was relatively easy to do because it was happening so frequently.
And again, how did you handle the consent? Did you work with kids' parents, lawyer? Like, what was the thing?
Yeah, we handled consent by approaching parents and guardians and being clear about what it meant to be published and to tell your story to a news organization, what it meant to be telling your story through visual images online, what it means to be on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, and really worked hard to explain to people who aren't always, incredibly savvy at dealing with the media, what it meant to tell your story to, potentially hundreds of thousands of people. So we tried to work very hard to gauge quickly whether people had comfort levels with telling their story to us. And if not, we were not in the business of negotiating for someone's story or talking them into telling their story. It was absolutely about, whether it was something they deeply wanted to share with us.
One thing that strikes me about all three of these stories, and yours in particular perhaps, is that it reflects issues that are crying out for community level reporting all over the country, right? If there are reporters listening who want to get a handle on the use of seclusion and restraint in their own communities, what's the best way to begin?
Many states require documentation at the school level. And one of the things that we learned early on was that the documentation was actually quite thorough and quite good. And so if I were a reporter in a local newsroom, I would go to my local school district and ask for this documentation, with student names redacted, of course, but to get that insight, I would go and look for the documents first.
Okay, well, thanks. And I think now what I'd like to do is ask Team DART to bring all of our speakers back up, and we're going to go to Q&A with the audience, which if we were in the same room at Columbia University, I'd have you come up to the mic. Instead, I have to ask your fingers to come up to the keyboard and throw some questions into the chat, into the Q&A. We already have some coming up. Or perhaps some others can come in. Here's one question from Claire Ryan, and this is a question to any of you, and maybe I'll broaden it out a little bit. She asks, what sort of support does your newsroom offer to you to limit the effects of vicarious trauma? And I'll broaden that slightly and say, these are all challenging stories. How did you handle your own self-care and manage whatever the impact may have been of long immersion in very difficult stuff? Any of you want to kind of leap out at that? somebody unmute and start talking. Deb, you're unmuted, so I'm going to make you talk.
Okay. Look, one of the things that journalists do is, if it's at the bar at night, when you're in a war zone, or with your friends when you come home from an assignment, is we talk. And we talk and we talk. And anybody who does work with PTSD will tell you that the best cure is the talking cure. You talk your trauma until it becomes so familiar that it doesn't rattle you anymore. And I think that is step one in self-care. NPR has peer counselors. I have signed up to be one for the first time because I feel like I owe, and I should. But I think that's step two. If you're still feeling rattled, that you can look at a long list of your colleagues in the company, and you can talk to them, and we will ratchet it up to somebody professional if you need it. But I think step one is incredibly important. We talk it out. It's what we do. When you make a narrative of something, you somehow control it. You capture it, and you can get past the worst of it.
Anyone else want to kind of chime in on this? Jen, go for it.
I just want to relay some advice for not after the interview, but during the interview. I've often found that I can become overly empathetic, and it can interrupt my reporting techniques. And I actually talked to Kizlan about this because I was having trouble on the last trip, and he just gave me this very simple technique, which is that our minds automatically start to imagine the other person as someone that we know that's close to us, whether it's a brother or a child or a parent, and that our imagination can start to create these connections that are beneficial for writers generally, but can really create more trauma than necessary in that moment. So there's a lot of work I've done with trying to create that space between me and a subject during the actual reporting. But there's also been moments where I've allowed myself to be very vulnerable in the moment and have cried with subjects. And that's actually been incredibly useful for creating a rapport between us and helping them to trust me. And I think just allowing yourself to either be as separate as you need to be to protect yourself, or to really engage with the subject can be helpful.
Anyone else want to add anything here? You don't have to, but Adam, you're the photographer in here, so I got to ask you.
Yeah. Well, I guess to answer the question specifically, I think PTSD hasn't been something that's been discussed very largely between kind of newsrooms and journalists in general. It's always been something that's kind of shied away from. But I think Deb's point was kind of spot on. I mean, I'm part of a community and a tribe of journalists and a fraternity of photographers, and I think talking to colleagues is the best support network that I have, but also just kind of realizing your limits. I get a lot of young photographers that write to me and tell me they want to, photograph combat and, head to precarious places. And I always kind of warn them that you've kind of got to be careful with, what you chew off and what you're ready to kind of process. I think when I was kind of, coming up as a photographer, I naively thought that this stuff wouldn't really affect me, and it definitely does, and it sets you off on a bit of a journey that you have to reconcile.
Yeah, and I should say to folks in the audience that this is an area where the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma has done a great deal of work, and there are a lot of resources on self-care, peer support, being a good colleague, and research on the Dart Center's website. So www.dartcenter.org. But it's a crucial area. Lucy, I'm going to throw a question to you that is for you specifically, but raises an interesting question from Kathy Best, who asks, one of your reporters, one of your colleagues, Cameron Evans, had been a student in one of these private treatment programs. Did that help the teens who were there to talk about their experience? How did you either lean into that or not?
Sorry, were you done?
No, I just it's come to my attention that Kathy is the executive editor, your former boss, but
my former boss, nudging me along. We did lean into that. I think I was actually out of the country and just met Cameron and Seaborn in person a couple days ago. So we were all reporting from different places when this was coming together. So I wasn't around for, Cameron's reporting, but I do know that she reached out to people saying this is an experience that I've also had, and I can, relate and empathize with what you're struggling with. And I think that definitely helped people trust her and open up to her about their experiences.
Here's a question kind of for the room from Jim Boggs, who is a very old Dart Center friend. Jim, nice to hear from you. Assuming it's the same Jim Boggs. Jim was part of one of the very first studies ever done of journalists and one of the very first training programs ever established in trauma-aware interviewing. And Jim asks, giving the interviewee agency in an interview was mentioned several times by several of you. Would any of you like to expand on that? What do you mean by giving agency? What are the ethics of it? What is it that we hand over when we talk about giving agency? Who wants to? Rachel, you're nodding.
Yeah. So I think that could definitely be misunderstood easily. As reporters, we're not to let people make decisions about what the story is. But I do think that, for me, especially reporting in a community that I live in, and having worked with victims and survivors for a long time, I really think that bringing them into the process and really walking them through each step of it, even more than I do in other types of stories. I mean, I think about with Sandy, stopping and checking in, is where we're going with this okay with you now? Or I've requested all of these records about your case, and I'm going to be reading them. These aren't things that you've seen. Do you want to know and see what's in these records as well? And at what point do you want to do that? So I think that you're not kind of foisting information upon someone, and you're also keeping them kind of up to date with where you're at and what you're doing in your process. And I think that's helpful because even if someone's really invested in telling a story like this, it's still really scary, and these are still the most often tough details of your life that other people are sorting through. And so I think having that kind of relationship is what I see as giving someone agency in the process.
Jennifer, you had your hand up there. What are you thinking about?
I was just going to say, I think that, sometimes giving people a little more power over how they're viewed later and how much they want to answer in the moment is okay. It's okay to not be pushing someone to react to something or be trying to cajole someone to be a character in your story. It's okay to step back and be human and let those people own their story and, just accept that you're being allowed to tell it. And for us at the end of our reporting, what that meant was saying to people, if at any point, even at midnight, before we press the button and publish, if you don't want to do this anymore, it's okay. And we really meant it, and our editors really meant it. And that is what we mean by understanding and giving people agency over their own stories.
That's, and that's a big gamble. Deb, you have to unmute.
Okay, hang on.
There you are. You're good.
Am I good? Okay.
You're good.
So what was interesting about this, it's different than a domestic trauma in that this has such an intimate international dimension. Yeah. And I have to say what I found extraordinary is that the Germans went ahead with this trial in the middle of COVID. Yeah. In the middle of a pandemic, they put up plexiglass around everybody that they didn't shirk. They didn't say, oh gosh, this is too hard. They didn't. They went ahead with it. And I think that they understood that in some ways they had to. It would have been catastrophic to not go ahead after everyone had been primed for this event. And I was pleased to see that the Germans did that.
Yeah. Here's a question from Steve Teach. And referring to the fact that at least two of these stories, maybe more, but at least two of you, Jen and Adam and Rachel and Andrea, your work involved sitting with survivors and their therapists And Steve asks, in observing a victim in session with their therapist, was there learning for you in how the therapist dealt that were maybe difficult issues for you? Is having a person skilled in the therapeutic approach to elicit and understand information a useful adjunct that you feel ought to be more common in dealing with issues in your stories, whether in the reporting in yourself or whatever? I think Steve's question is, what did you learn from actually reporting in the presence of a clinician? Jen, do you want to try that one? You'll have to unmute. There you go.
I mean, that's such an interesting question. I'm not sure I'd really thought about having a clinician present in other stories. But I think it's kind of it's work we actually should be doing anyway when we're reporting. It's this kind of question and answer. It's talk therapy. I mean, in this case, it was very straightforward. These women and children were kind of narrating how they were feeling and what they remember about their life, and putting their autobiography simply in order. So in some ways, it's interesting to see just how gentle they were, and sort of how even these simple questions can be very useful for a subject to organize their thoughts, perhaps, is something useful to learn from them. But I have done a lot of research on talk therapy, and I think it is very useful for anyone to read about it actually when you're dealing with subjects, because it's all about this dialogue. So I think it's if you can imagine them as kind of a ghost in the room in the future, that's certainly useful.
Rachel and Andrea, what was, it's really so exceptional as reporters we may be in therapy, we may report on people who are in therapy, but the intersection of those is pretty unusual. What was that like? Andrea, you're nodding. What are you thinking?
So I think that we weren't like in a therapy session, but we chose this kind of space. And I have to say that that Kate is such a skilled trauma therapist that with all of us in the room, we were really learning, we were approaching this initially, looking at the criminal justice aspect in terms of solving the rape. But at the same time, Kate was able to really point out for us in our conversations with Sandy, the parts of the trauma that she was feeling that were really more based on what the system was doing. She, because she's been doing this for a long time, could point to things and say, this isn't the assault that's causing this reaction. This is the system ignoring what happened. And she could really pinpoint that. And I think Andrea had another thing that she learned from that.
Yeah. Kate also opened our eyes to the trauma of the investigators who weren't doing the work that really helped us in writing the story and reporting the story and trying to deal with the system. She actually said, and I'll never forget it, she said the way we treat our police, the way they're cared for within the department, the way their trauma is considered, is the way they treat their victims. And that was so illuminating to us and so important. And I'd also like to add that Kate would send us little emails saying, I just want to make sure you guys are okay. She would check in with us. So she was giving us a little bit of free therapy, I think, friendly. And that was
cool.
Yeah, I just felt like she had us she had all of us kind of on her radar, and that felt very good.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and there are a bunch of questions that we haven't gotten to, but I'm going to kind of take the chair's privilege and ask a closing question for all of you, and it refers back to something Deb said at the beginning about the difficulty in trauma reporting of balancing the sensational and the reflective. You want readers, viewers, listeners, downloaders to be paying attention to this work. And they are all stories rooted in horrific, violent, spectacular experiences that are just clickbait. The subject of any of these stories could be clickbait. And yet you're trying to do something else to instigate attention, respect, compassion, perhaps change. What's an example of a choice you made Or how did you think through that balance between compelling work and work that is respectful and dignified and provokes thought? Jennifer, go for it. But unmute. Yes, okay.
We made a decision very early on that we wanted to make sure we were portraying these children who had experienced trauma as children, and that people saw them as children. And so a lot of the choices and images that we made showed the kids playing and doing something they love, rather than associating them visually with the trauma that they'd experienced. And that was just part of making sure that their story was as transparent as possible to everybody who was going to encounter, you know, these characters in an otherwise horrific situation.
Lucy, how about you? How did you manage that one? It's a storytelling question, you know?
Yeah, and a good question. I think our story does lead with the deaths of 2 students, which I think is kind of a bold decision that puts
it's jolting.
You know, something traumatic right at the beginning. But I think not going into the details of that, you know, too much, but instead kind of focusing on the structure of, like, the fact that it was the lack of regulation and the system that kind of allowed these things to continue. So I guess I would say bringing the reader also back to the structural problems and not just focusing on the trauma. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Jen, Adam, how did you think about that the tension between gripping and breathing?
I mean, I'll just say quickly, like, no one should be defined by their worst moments. None of us want to be defined by our worst moments. You have to start to expand outwardly from that moment and kind of look for details that can disrupt the narrative you are trying to tell with honesty that might be very disturbing, but that might sort of add texture and depth. So I tried to do that in this story, even though a lot of my profiles of characters were very short, with imagery that felt humanizing or sort of, again, just sort of disrupted, like a stereotypical image you might have of a radicalized child soldier, the sparkles on their shirts, the singing and the playing, the way they contradicted themselves as if they were just sort of ventriloquizing ISIS. It's not them. And so really making that point clear that they're moving in and out of this situation, and it's not really them, it's something they're kind of performing at that moment.
Adam, is there a visual analog to that?
Yeah, I think I'll echo Jen in many ways. You know, like, trauma is very complex. I mean, as a photographer, when I approached this story, I think it would have been very easy for me to portray all these kind of children and people in a way that made them feel very kind of sad, or make images which you know, represent sadness. But obviously trauma is much more nuanced than that. There can be happiness in trauma. There's pain, there's all these other emotions that come into this kind of psychological journey that people go on. And I think for me, visually, it was really about capturing an image that felt that nuanced, that didn't just feel like I was pigeonholing people as being sad and upset.
Yeah. Rachel, Andrea, how did you solve this one?
You know, I think it's what a lot of folks here are saying. It's about balance. You know, you have these really extremely difficult things people went through. But if I think specifically about Sandy and her story, we really pushed to include these moments that often can end up on the cutting room floor if you're editing a really long narrative. But I think of a moment at the end of the story where she had been unable to eat sauerkraut, which is very Cleveland. Sauerkraut's very important. And she has this moment where she's able to kind of just take this and crunch on it and just overcome this, you know, kind of thing that would send her into a flashback. And I think those kind of moments just when you have those in a story and you leave space for those, you even things out, you balance things, and then you tell kind of the whole story and not just that part of the story that can feel very difficult and sometimes sensational. And so I think as reporters, fighting for those moments to me is the most important thing. And also fighting for the way that trauma impacts people, because I think a lot of the stories we're talking about, they're in frames, like a justice system frame or a school discipline frame, and kind of breaking out of those frames and viewing things how victims or survivors view them, which is not in that framework, and letting them have that room to breathe in their lives about how they deal with something instead of how a system deals with something is important as well.
Yeah, and in terms of, in terms of narrative, there was a lot of discussion and pushback we got to end it in the courtroom, to end it when, he's sentenced, she wins. But it's not about that. That's not the end of her story. Her story continues. So we had to fight very hard, and we had a wonderful editor that supported us. But the traditional narrative is, it's the SUV or SVU, law and order, boom, boom, the sentencing, right? And we said, no, this is about also, of course, the journey to get there was, of course, part of the narrative, but the aftermath that continues after people close the story for Sandy is so important.
Yeah.
So yes, that's so important for people to think about when they're tackling these stories. Get out of the box, the law and order box, if you can.
And Deb, since you kind of instigated, so you seeded this question, I'm going to give the last word to you on this. How did you, in this very difficult piece about torture survivors, maybe either as a technical matter or as a reporting matter, balance the sensational and the compelling?
So I'm going to echo what everybody said, because we've all been in the same boat and using the same techniques. And one is, I probably have 2 hours of horrible detail about what was done in those prisons. And I remember listening to it was hard, logging the audio was harder. And so I was well aware that I had to be that was like a soupçon of those stories. Otherwise they're too hard. Two, and I think this is exactly what everybody's talked about, is this notion of framing. Are these tragic victims or are they resilient survivors? And I always kept in my head that these are resilient survivors. And so that made the choices easier, because that's the picture that as a reporter, and you have this choice, you can decide, they can be victims or they can be resilient. And if you are honest about what you're looking at, it's resilience. And if you keep that as your frame, it makes it easier to figure out how to do it.
That, I think, is as good a point as any to wind the conversation down. We have come to the end of our time, but I hope this is actually, for everyone here in the room, first of all, in the present tense, a source of excitement and inspiration. I hope you'll turn to all of these stories, which are on the Dart Center website, www.dartcenter.org. But I also hope these actually instigate further conversations. If you are journalists, conversations about how to do these stories. If you are consumers of journalism, how to support this kind of reporting and the kinds of journalists you've met tonight. I want to do a couple of thank yous. I want to thank the Dart Center team, Ariel Richin, Kate Black, Isabel Thompson, and Camille Baker, who have been behind the scenes driving this strange vehicle called Zoom and making the evening happen. Also our friends at the Tao Center for Digital Media at Columbia University, who lent us their Zoom webinar account so we could accommodate all the folks who signed up. Want to thank, of course, especially all of our panelists, all of our winners, for your extraordinary work that we hope will continue. And of course, thanking Ken Dart and the Dart Foundation for making it possible for the Dart Awards and for the work of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma to go on in the coming years at a time when the world really needs it. Thank you all, and good night.